I've kept a ledger my whole life. Not for money, I never had much of that. For moments. The kind that don't make sense until years later, when you're sitting by a fire that's almost out and you finally understand what you were witnessing. I wrote the first entry about Elias Runningwater on a Tuesday in October, using the stub of a pencil I'd been sharpening with my thumbnail for 3 weeks. The entry was 4 words long. The man is serious. That was before the winter, before the walls held, before I understood what a man can carry inside him when everything outside is trying to kill him, and why some people don't just survive a thing, they let it change the actual shape of them. I've filled half a ledger since then. This is what I wrote. The first time I saw Elias Runningwater, he was digging a hole in the ground like a man possessed. Not a grave, though I'll admit that was my first thought. The hole was wide, maybe 12 feet across, maybe more, and it went down 3 feet, 4. He was standing inside it by the time I rode close enough to call out, and all I could see was the crown of his hat and his shoulders rising and falling with the rhythm of someone who had decided, deeply and without apology, that this particular piece of earth needed to be removed. "Hey," I called. He didn't stop. I tied my horse Biscuit, a name I didn't give her and was too embarrassed to change, to a pine branch and walked over. The land up here was high plateau country, eastern Wyoming, where the wind comes at you sideways and the sky in October looks like a bruise healing wrong. I'd ridden out from the Thatcher Ranch, 2 miles south, because Walt Thatcher had told me there was a strange man up on the ridge doing something he couldn't explain, and Walt was not a man who said things like that lightly. I stood at the edge of the hole and looked down. Elias Runningwater was Apache, or half anyway. I'd learn the rest of his particular biography later. He was maybe 50, maybe younger, with the kind of face that outdoor living carves into a man slowly and without vanity. He had a gray streak in his hair that ran from his left temple straight back, like a lightning bolt frozen mid-strike. His hands were extraordinary, wide, thick-knuckled, quick. The kind of hands that have solved 1,000 problems and remember every one. He looked up at me. "You going to help or watch?" he said. I opened my mouth to say watch, because that was the honest answer. Then something in the way he looked at me, not challenging, not unfriendly, just direct, like he was genuinely curious, made me reach down for the second shovel leaning against the dirt wall. That's how I met him. I climbed into a hole in the ground and started digging. His name, he told me between shovel loads, was Elias Runningwater. He had grown up on the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, left at 17, worked timber in Oregon, fishing boats in Alaska, cattle in New Mexico, and had spent the last 4 years doing something he was reluctant to describe in plain terms. "Research," he said finally. "What kind of research?" "The kind that doesn't come with a salary." I learned to read his pauses. When Elias went quiet, he wasn't being evasive. He was finding the right words for something he'd thought about in a language that didn't always translate cleanly into conversation. I noticed that about him early. He spoke slowly not because he was uncertain, but because he was precise. The land was his, technically. He'd bought it 2 years ago, 40 acres of high plateau that nobody else had wanted because it had no road access, questionable water rights, and a soil composition that made farming a polite joke. He'd paid almost nothing for it. He had plans for it that were, by any reasonable measure, insane. He was going to build a cabin. Not a cabin with a basement dug by machine, framed by purchased lumber, roofed by a contractor. He was going to build it the way he'd spent 4 years learning to build it, using principles drawn from structures that had survived not decades but centuries, millennia in some cases. He told me about it that first day while we dug, and I'll be honest, I thought he was a man whose isolation had curdled into something romantic and impractical. I'd met those men before. They came up into the high country with books and ideas and left, 2 winters later with frostbite and humidity. But I kept listening, because the way Elias described things made you feel like you were watching them happen. The Egyptians dug down, he said, scooping a load of earth and tossing it clean over the lip of the hole. Not just for tombs, for homes. The oldest surviving domestic structures in the region are partially subterranean. The earth itself is the insulation, constant temperature, no drafts. In the desert it keeps you cool, in the cold it keeps you alive. I paused on my shovel. You learned Egyptian building techniques. I learned earth techniques, he said. The Egyptians figured them out 3,000 years ago. The Anasazi had their own version here in the Southwest. Indigenous peoples in Siberia, Iceland, Korea, different names, same physics. He glanced up at the sky, which was going that particular shade of early October gray that meant business. The earth remembers what it learned. You just have to ask it right. I should tell you about the ledger, since it matters. My name is Calvin Prout. Was a hired hand of general utility, the kind of man ranches keep around not because of any singular skill but because of an accumulation of useful ones. I could fix fence, birth calves, track water tables, patch roofs, read weather, and cook well enough that nobody complained. I was 43 years old that October. I had no family within 1,000 miles, and no great ambition beyond competence. I kept the ledger because my mother had kept one and her mother before her, and it was the one inheritance I'd actually received. Write down the things worth keeping, my mother had told me. Not everything, just the things you'd regret forgetting. I'd been writing in ledgers for 20 years. I had 11 of them in a box under my bunk at the Thatcher Ranch. They were full of observations about weather, animals, machines, people, small things. The way a horse holds its ears before it spooks, the particular silence before a lightning strike, the expression on a man's face when he gets news he's been dreading. That first night I wrote, "The man is serious." Then I added in smaller writing, "He knows something." I came back the next morning without being asked. And the morning after that. I told myself I was curious. That was true, but it was also incomplete. The fuller truth was that watching Elias work was like watching someone do something ancient with total confidence, and I had not felt that in the presence of another person in a long time. He had a system, the hole which he called the thermal mass excavation, though he never used that phrase with any pretension, was just the beginning. Once it reached the right depth, he began laying the foundation stones. Not poured concrete. Stones, fitted together using a technique he showed me with patient hands, demonstrating how each piece was shaped and placed to distribute weight not just downward but outward, the way a tree spreads its roots. Lime mortar, he told me, mixing a batch from materials he'd sourced and prepared over the previous weeks. 3,000 years old. Still used in restoration work on ancient sites, breathes, moves with the structure instead of cracking against it. Where'd you learn all this? He was quiet for a moment. Books, ruins, watching. Watching who? Old people mostly. He smoothed a line of mortar with practiced precision. My grandmother's house on the reservation was partially earth-sheltered. She didn't know it had an Egyptian name, she just knew it stayed warm. He paused. She died the winter I was 8. Bad cold that season. I've thought about that house ever since. He said it the way a man says something he's carried so long it's become part of his balance. Not for sympathy. Just because it was true, and truth was how Elias organized the world. I wrote in my ledger that night, his grandmother, that's what this is really about. The walls went up through October. I'm going to try to describe what watching Elias build felt like, because I've seen structures go up before and it was never like this. Most construction is subtraction. You strip the land, you pour a foundation that fights the earth, you raise walls that keep the outside out. The whole philosophy is one of resistance. Nature is the enemy. You defeat it with materials and angles and mechanical force. Elias built like he was cooperating. The walls of the cabin were thick, 20 inches in places, with a rubble and lime core that he told me was essentially the same construction as Roman walls that had stood 2,000 years. The windows were few and small, positioned not for aesthetics, but for thermal function, south-facing, to catch winter sun, set deep into the walls so the summer sun couldn't penetrate. The roof line was low on the north side, nearly buried in the berm of earth he'd pushed up against the back wall. The whole structure seemed to be growing out of the hillside, rather than sitting on top of it. "It's not fighting the mountain," I said one afternoon, stepping back to look at it. He looked at what he'd built, and something in his face shifted just slightly, just enough that I caught it and wrote it down later. A kind of painful satisfaction, like a man who has solved a problem that cost him something. "No," he said, "it's not. The trouble started in late October, and it didn't come from the weather. It came from Dale Harmon." Harmon owned the land adjacent to Elias' 40 acres, 200 acres of grazing land that he ran cattle on and resented sharing the plateau with any neighbor at all. He was a big man, Dale Harmon, not tall so much as wide, with a jaw like a shelf, and eyes the color of old denim, pale and washed out, and carrying an expression of permanent mild grievance. He'd been looking for a reason to come up to the ridge since Elias had started work, and one Tuesday morning he found one. The water. There was a spring on Elias' land, a modest one, but reliable, and the drainage from it ran across a corner of Harmon's property. Harmon claimed that Elias' excavation had altered the drainage and was now sending water into a low corner where he ran cattle in late autumn. He rode up with two of his hands and stood at the edge of Elias' work, and said his piece in the loud, declarative tone of a man who expects volume to substitute for evidence. I was there. I was mixing mortar and trying to become invisible, which is a thing a ledger keeper learns to do in tense situations. I watched Elias listen to Harmon without interrupting, without moving from where he stood, without any visible shift in his expression. Harmon finished, the silence stretched. "The drainage hasn't changed," Elias said. "I can show you the grade." "I don't need you to show me anything on my own land." "Then we have a misunderstanding," Elias said, "and I'd rather resolve it than litigate it." Harmon's eyes moved over the half-built structure behind Elias, the thick walls, the earth berm, the strange, ancient-looking lines of it. I could see him trying to categorize it and failing, which bothered him more than he let on. "What the hell are you building anyway?" he said. "Looks like something that ought to be buried." Elias looked at his cabin for a moment. "It will be," he said. "Mostly." Harmon rode away unsatisfied, which is its own kind of trouble, the kind that sits and waits and sours. I wrote in my ledger, "Harmon will come back," the kind of man who needs to be right about something. The walls were finished in the first week of November. Elias stood inside the completed shell of the structure one afternoon, when the temperature had dropped to the upper 20s, and a wind was building from the northwest that rattled the pine branches and sent dead leaves skittering across the plateau like they were late for something. Inside the cabin it was calm. Not warm, exactly, he hadn't started the small central hearth yet, but the wind was simply absent. The thick walls absorbed it. The earth berm behind us blocked the northern exposure completely. The temperature inside, without any fire, was something like 50 degrees, remarkable against the 28 outside. Elias put his hand on the wall, flat palm against the stone and lime. He stood like that for a long moment. "Is it what you thought it would be?" I asked. He took his hand away, looked at it briefly, the way a man looks at his hands when he's been doing something for a very long time. "Close," he said. I didn't push, but that night I wrote, "He's measuring it against something inside him, something I can't see, maybe his grandmother's house, maybe just the idea of a house that doesn't lose to winter." The roof took another week. Timber frames sourced from deadfall on his own land, cut and dried and fitted, covered with a rubble and lime layer, then a thick bed of earth and sod over that. When it was done, the cabin looked from the north side like part of the hillside, like something that had always been there. I helped him move in on a Sunday. His possessions were modest: a cot, a wood stove, the one mechanical concession, and a small one, a dozen books, a kerosene lamp, 2 cast-iron pans, a canvas bag of tools, and a wooden box he handled with a care that told me it mattered without his saying so. I didn't ask about the box. "You really think this'll hold?" I said, looking around the interior. The hearth was lit for the first time. The smoke drew clean up the small chimney. The firelight caught the lime-white walls and made them glow. Elias sat on the edge of his cot and laced his hands together. "The physics says yes," he said. "What does your gut say?" He looked at the fire for a moment. "Ask me in February," he said. I pulled on my coat and stepped toward the door. Outside, the wind had picked up. The temperature was dropping toward 10 degrees. Biscuit was anxious, stamping and pulling at the branch I'd tied her to. I paused at the door and looked back at the small, fire-lit room. At Elias sitting in the light with his hands loose in his lap, looking like a man who had built the one thing he needed to build and was now waiting to find out what that meant. The door closed between us. I rode down the ridge in the dark, the wind at my back, and I thought about physics and grandmothers, and what it means to build something the world has spent 3,000 years teaching us was worth building. I thought about it the whole way home. December came in like a door being kicked open. Not gradually, not with the usual slow-building gray of early winter, the tentative frosts and reluctant freezes that give a man time to think. December arrived on a Monday with a front that pushed down from Canada, with the kind of indifference that reminds you what this country actually is beneath the parts we've tamed. The temperature at the Thatcher Ranch dropped 30 degrees in 6 hours. The water troughs froze solid by noon. Walt's oldest mare, a sensible animal who had navigated 20 Wyoming winters without complaint, stood in the barn and trembled. I made my ledger entry that night. This is the one. Whatever winter usually is, this one is more. My first thought, and I'm not ashamed to say it, was Elias. I rode up the ridge the next morning. The trail was drifted in places, not impassable, not yet, but the kind of drifts that tell you what's coming. The temperature was -12. The air had that particular quality it gets at extreme cold, a hardness, a silence, as if the sound itself has contracted. My breath came out in clouds and disappeared. The cabin was there. That sounds simple. It wasn't simple. After a night at -12 with 40-mile winds, in a structure with no central heating beyond a small wood stove, the fact that the cabin was there, undamaged, smoke rising from the chimney, door intact, felt like a statement. Like the land had thrown something at it, and the cabin had responded with calm. I knocked. Elias opened the door. He was in his shirt sleeves. "Come in," he said. "Coffee's hot." The interior temperature, he told me, had not dropped below 44 degrees overnight. That was without constant fire. He'd let the stove go to coals around midnight, and it had recovered the space to livable warmth by morning with a modest reload of wood. "The earth is doing it," he said, pouring coffee into a tin cup and handing it to me. The ground temperature 4 feet down holds around 52 degrees year-round in this climate. The floor, the lower walls, they're radiating that. The stove only has to make up the difference. I looked at the floor. Packed earth, covered in places with woven mats he'd made himself from material I couldn't identify. The walls around me thick, pale, calm. The ceiling low. The air inside still and warm, genuinely warm in a way that the Thatcher bunkhouse with its blazing iron stove rarely achieved because the cold pried in through every seam. "How much wood did you burn?" I asked. 2 loads. I sat with that. 2 loads overnight in -12. The bunkhouse burned 6 and stayed drafty. I wrote in my ledger later, The physics was right, he was right. I don't know why I'm surprised. I watched him build it, but I'm surprised. I came back every 3 or 4 days through December. Not because Elias asked. He was self-sufficient in a way that went beyond practicality into something almost philosophical, a deep, unself-conscious competence that I found myself measuring my own life against in quiet moments. I came back because watching him live in that cabin during that December was the most interesting thing happening anywhere within 50 miles, and I had a ledger to fill. He had a routine. He split wood in the morning, not much, just enough, and stacked it inside by the door where the cabin's warmth kept it dry. He read in the afternoons, a mix of engineering texts and older things, a translation of a Roman agricultural manual, a worn copy of an ethnography of the Anasazi that he'd clearly read a dozen times. He cooked on the small stove. Beans, rice, dried meat, the occasional rabbit from the traps he ran on the property's eastern edge. He had projects, always projects. He was working on something with the spring drainage, a small system of channels that would, he explained, carry meltwater not off the land but to a collection point, a buried cistern he planned to dig in spring. He had notes spread across a plank table, sketches, calculations, the work of a man who is never finished solving the problem, only finished with this particular phase of it. "You ever stop?" I asked him one afternoon, watching him work a piece of stone with a chisel, shaping a small corbel for a shelf he was adding to the interior wall. "Stop what?" "Building, planning, fixing." He looked at the corbel, turned it over in his hands. "My grandmother used to say that a house is never finished," he said. "You just stop adding to it for a while." She say that a lot. She said a lot of things I didn't understand until later. He set the corbel down and picked up his chisel again. "That's what grandmothers do, I think. Store wisdom in you before you know what it is." The second week of December, Dale Harmon came back. I wasn't there this time. I heard about it from Elias, told in the flat, factual way he told most things, without editorial, letting the details carry the weight. Harmon had ridden up alone in the early evening and stood outside the cabin for a while before knocking. When Elias opened the door, Harmon stood in the cold and looked past him into the lit interior. "Thought you'd have frozen out by now," Harmon said. Elias told me. He stepped aside and gestured for Harmon to come in. Harmon hesitated, the hesitation of a man who hadn't planned for this, who had arrived to witness a failure and found instead an invitation. He came in. Elias gave him coffee. They sat, Harmon taking the single chair, Elias on the edge of his cot, and Harmon looked around the cabin with the expression of a man who is recalibrating something he thought was settled. "You really built this yourself," Harmon said, "not a question." "With some help," Elias said. He was, I believe, referring to me, which was both more credit than I deserved, and exactly the kind of thing Elias would say. Harmon set his cup down. He looked at the walls, the thickness of them, the pale lime surface, the way the firelight moved on them. "My grandfather had a dugout," he said. "Not like this, just a hole in a hill with boards over it. Hated it." He paused, "but it stayed warm." Elias said nothing. "The water thing," Harmon said. He looked at the floor. "Maybe I was wrong about the drainage. Cold's making it worse. Different issue." It was as close to an apology as a man like Harmon could manage, and Elias, to his credit, received it without triumph. "I'll look at it in spring," Elias said. "See if there's something I can do on my end." Harmon left without the thing he'd ridden up to confirm and left carrying something else instead. I couldn't say what exactly. I wrote it as, "Harmon came to watch Elias fail, left having seen something he'll think about." Christmas passed quietly. I brought Elias a bottle of whiskey and a bag of flour on Christmas Eve. He gave me a piece of carved stone, a small, flat piece of plateau limestone he'd worked into the shape of something that was either a bird or an arrowhead, and which somehow, in the right light, looked like both. You didn't have to carve me something, I said. I was carving anyway, he said. It needed to go somewhere. We sat by his stove for a couple of hours, drank some of the whiskey, talked about nothing of great significance. His time in Alaska, my time in Texas before Wyoming, a particularly maddening fence design we both had opinions about. The cabin was warm and the wind was not inside it, and the lamp made the lime walls honey-colored, and I thought, for just a moment, that I understood what his grandmother's house must have felt like to a small boy in Arizona. I wrote in my ledger that night, this is what he was building toward, not a structure, a feeling, the feeling of a house that doesn't apologize for existing. Then January hit. I'm going to be direct about what January was. The National Weather Service, when I looked it up later, called it a historic cold event for the region. That means nothing until you've been in it. The temperature at the Thatcher Ranch reached -31 degrees on January 14th. The wind was consistent 30 miles an hour with gusts to 50. The wind chill was somewhere around -60, which is the kind of number that stops being a measurement and becomes a condition. Pipes froze in concrete block buildings. A metal gate at the Thatcher barn cracked, just cracked from the contraction. The diesel in Walt's truck gelled and wouldn't start for 3 days. 2 of our calves didn't survive the first week. I couldn't reach Elias. The trail up the ridge drifted closed after the second day. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was moving, horizontal, ground driven by the wind, building into formations that looked geological. I tried twice to get up on Biscuit and turned back both times. The horse had better sense than I did and communicated it by stopping and refusing to face the wind. I won't describe the specific texture of that worry. I'll just say I started filling ledger pages with things that weren't quite prayers and weren't quite plans. The worried scribbling of a man who has identified a problem he can't solve and keeps returning to it anyway. On the 4th day, the wind dropped. I rode up at first light. The cabin was buried. That's not quite right. The snow had drifted around and over it, the roof berm, the north-facing earth wall, until the structure was half merged with the hillside, which was what it had always looked like, but now more so, more complete, like winter had finished a sentence the building had started. Smoke from the chimney. Thin, steady, real. I knocked, then knocked harder because my hand had lost feeling. The door opened. Elias looked at me with an expression that contained several things in rapid sequence. Surprise, something that might have been relief, and then a return to his baseline, that level, considering calm. "Calvin," he said. "Elias," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. He pulled the door open and I stepped inside. The cabin was warm. Not comfortable warm. Warm. Genuinely, physically, unmistakably warm in a way that after 4 days of -30-something felt like an argument won, like evidence, like a man standing in the middle of his proof. The interior temperature, he told me later, had never dropped below 40 degrees. Even at the worst of it, -31 outside, wind chill of 60 below. The stove had run low once, and he'd let it go to coals for a few hours to conserve wood, and the temperature had drifted to 40 but held there, sustained by the earth and the walls and the 3,000-year-old secret of mass and insulation, and working with the ground instead of against it. He'd been fine. He looked, in fact, slightly bored. He'd finished the Roman agricultural manual and started a book on Mongolian yurt construction. I sat down in the chair and looked at the walls for a while and didn't say anything. Elias poured coffee, set it in front of me, sat on his cot. "How bad is it down below?" he said. "Bad," I said. 2 calves, Walt's truck, the gate cracked. He nodded. "I'm sorry about the calves," he said. We sat with the fire for a while. The lamp was lit even though it was morning, the small windows let in limited light, and in the deep drift shadow of the buried cabin it was a dim, honeyed, held space, like being inside something that had decided to keep you. 4 days, I said. Yep. -31. Yep, he looked at his coffee. -33 the second night. My thermometer. I looked at the walls, ran my hand along the nearest one, the lime-cool surface that somehow, impossibly, was warmer than the air outside by 60 degrees. Your grandmother, I said. He looked up. Did she know that what she had was this? Elias looked at the wall, at the fire, at his hands. She knew it worked, he said. She didn't have a name for why. He paused. I don't think names mattered to her, just the warmth. I left mid-afternoon when the light was still good. At the door I paused, because I had a question I'd been carrying for 2 months and hadn't found the right moment for. Why this? I said. Why all of it? The research, the years, all of it. Why up here alone? Elias was quiet for a moment. Because the winter she died, he said, the house wasn't warm enough. He said it without drama, without performance, in the same voice he'd used to explain lime-mortar ratios or drainage grades. She had the right house, just not warm enough. I always thought if someone had known what the Egyptians knew, what the Anasazi knew, what all of them knew, she might have been fine, just fine. He reached past me and opened the door. The cold came in hard and immediate. She might have been fine, he said again, quietly, to himself mostly. I stepped out into the white. The door closed behind me. I stood in the snow for a moment before walking to Biscuit, and I thought about a boy of 8 and a house in Arizona, and a winter that took something from him that he'd spent the next 40 years trying to give back. I got on my horse, rode down the ridge. The cold was everywhere and enormous, and the little cabin on the hillside was already invisible behind me, merged into the white, indistinguishable from the mountain. Except for the smoke. Thin, steady, real. February didn't apologize for January. It just continued it, which is its own kind of cruelty. The exhaustion of a cold that refuses to acknowledge it should be softening. By the second week of February, the men at the Thatcher Ranch had the gray, inward look of people who have stopped expecting things to improve and are simply managing. Walt barely spoke at meals. The horses stood in the barn with that hollow patience that animals develop in hard winters, the patience of creatures that have decided waiting is the only viable plan. I rode up to see Elias twice, a week through February. Not entirely for his sake. I want to be honest about that in the ledger, the way I try to be honest about everything. Going up the ridge was the one thing in my week that felt like motion. Watching Elias in that cabin, reading, working, maintaining, calmly inhabiting the structure he'd built, was the one thing in my week that felt like evidence that something could be done right. He was teaching me things I hadn't asked to learn. The third week of February, I arrived to find the door open. Not ajar, open, standing wide in -20 air, and from 30 yards away I could feel the heat bleeding out of it like something living was leaving. I called out, "Nothing." I ran, or what passes for running in that depth of snow, a lurching, high-stepping stumble, and got to the door and looked inside. The cabin was empty. The fire was out. Not banked, not cold out, the stove gray and cold, which takes hours. The lamp was unlit. The books were on the table, the wooden box in its corner. Everything was in its place. Elias was not. I went back outside and looked at the snow. Tracks, going north toward the tree line, maybe 2 hours old. The edges had softened in the slight warming of midday. I followed them. I found him at the spring. He was on his knees in the snow at the edge of where the spring emerged from the rock face, and for one long, terrible second, I thought he was hurt, and then I saw what he was doing. He was clearing ice from around the spring mouth with his bare hands. Elias. He looked up. His hands were the color of the snow. "The spring's freezing at the exit point," he said. "If it backs up, it'll push ice into the drainage and crack the rock face. I'll lose it." His hands. "Your hands," I said. "I know." He looked at them briefly, clinically, the way he looked at problems he was solving. I need another 5 minutes. I pulled off my gloves and got down beside him. We worked side by side in the snow, breaking and clearing the ice shelf that had built up over the spring mouth. The water under it was moving, alive, the dark cold of it shockingly real against fingers that stopped reporting sensation after about 3 minutes. I understand in that specific 5 minutes why people lose fingers and don't notice. The absence of pain is not the same as the absence of damage, and your hands can be very busy destroying themselves while your brain is occupied with the task. When the spring was clear and running properly, Elias stood. He looked at his hands, then looked at mine. "Come inside," he said. We warmed our hands in a bowl of lukewarm water that he heated on the stove with methodical patience. Not too hot, never too hot, while sensation returned in the way it does, not all at once, not painlessly. "You should have waited for me," I said. "I didn't know when you were coming. Tomorrow, the next day you could have." "It couldn't wait," he said, not defensive, just explanatory. "The spring is the whole system. Without the spring water for spring planting, without the cistern filled, the whole second year doesn't work." I looked at him. "You're thinking about next year," I said. "We're in the second week of February in the worst winter in 20 years, and you're thinking about next year." He looked up from the water bowl. "Why wouldn't I be?" he said. There was something in his expression that I've tried several times to write down accurately and keep failing at. It wasn't confidence exactly. Confidence implies a dismissal of risk, and Elias wasn't dismissing anything. It was more like orientation. The way a compass needle swings north not because it's choosing to, but because that's what it's constituted to do. Elias was constituted to look at what came next. It was structural in him, the way the cabin was structural. I didn't have a word for it then. I think I have one now: faithfulness. Not to a god or a creed, to the work, to the thing he decided the work was for. His grandmother, the warmth she should have had. Something shifted in late February, and I want to describe it carefully because it's the kind of shift that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Harmon came up again. I was there this time. I was sitting at Elias' table working on a calculation he'd asked me to check. A drainage grade measurement that required more arithmetic than I was proud to admit I needed help with when we heard the horse. Harmon dismounted and knocked, came in when Elias opened the door. But this time he had his son with him. Harmon's boy, 17, maybe 18, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, which I'd seen once in passing and which were thoughtful, stood just inside the door and looked around the cabin with the expression of someone encountering something they have no category for. "He wants to see it," Harmon said, gruff, almost apologetic. Wouldn't stop asking. The boy's name was Tommy. He asked Elias 3 questions in the first 2 minutes, smart ones, about the wall thickness, about why the windows faced that direction, about what the berm at the north end accomplished. Elias answered each one with the same patient precision he brought to everything, and I watched Tommy's face while Elias talked. Something was building in it, a kind of lit attention, the expression of a young person encountering something they hadn't known existed and recognizing, with the particular clarity that only the young have access to, that it changes what's possible. Harmon watched his son and didn't say anything. After about 20 minutes, Tommy asked if he could touch the walls. "Yes," Elias said. The boy put his palm flat against the lime surface, held it there. "It's warm," he said. "The earth behind it is warm," Elias said. "The wall carries it." Tommy looked at his hand on the wall. "My dad says you learned this from the Egyptians." "From a lot of people," Elias said. "The Egyptians, the Anasazi, my grandmother." He paused. "Knowledge doesn't belong to any one place. It just lives in whoever took the time to figure it out." Tommy turned to his father. Something passed between them. I couldn't read it exactly, but it had the quality of a renegotiation, subtle and important. Harmon cleared his throat. He's thinking about building something of his own, on the south pasture. Elias looked at the boy. How old are you? 18 in March. You good with your hands? Tommy glanced at his father, then back. Yeah. Come up in April, Elias said. When the ground's workable, I'll show you how to start. Harmon looked at Elias. It was a long look, the kind that contains an apology that's already been given and an acknowledgement that's harder to voice. He gave a single nod. They left. We watched them ride down the ridge, father and son, the boy talking and gesturing and Harmon listening with an expression I couldn't have described in fewer than a paragraph. You'd teach him, I said, after everything with Harmon. Elias was quiet for a moment. The knowledge isn't mine, he said. It's thousands of years old. I'd be a pretty sorry person to hoard it. March came. Not gently. March in Wyoming doesn't do gentle. But the light changed, the quality of it, the angle, the way it hit the south-facing windows of the cabin in the afternoon, and moved across the lime-white interior in a slow gold sweep that I don't think Elias had calculated but which felt, the first time I saw it, like a reward, like the building receiving something. I found him one afternoon in mid-March, sitting in that light. He was in his chair, the only chair, which he'd built himself from split timber and rawhide, with the wooden box on his lap, open. I stopped at the door. He didn't hear me. Inside the box I could see at that angle in that light there were photographs, old ones soft-edged, a boy, a woman, a house. I backed away from the door and knocked. He closed the box. Come in. I didn't mention what I'd seen, but that night I wrote, the box, his grandmother, the photographs. He's been showing her in some way I don't have language for that it worked, that the house worked, that she would have been warm. I stared at that entry for a long time before I closed the ledger. The winter broke, properly and officially, on March 21st. I know the date because I wrote it down. The temperature reached 41 degrees. The south-facing drifts began to soften. Water started moving in places it had been frozen for 11 weeks. Biscuit, for the first time since January, wanted to move faster than a walk. I rode up to tell Elias. He already knew, of course. He was outside when I arrived at the edge of the spring, watching the water flow. It held, I said. He looked at the cabin, at the berm, still snow-covered, merging into the hillside, at the south windows catching the March light. It held, he said. We stood there for a moment in the sun that was not yet warm but was present, genuinely and insistently present. And I thought about 11 weeks and -33, and a boy kneeling at a frozen spring and 2 hands in cold water, and a wooden box of photographs, and 3,000 years of people figuring out how not to freeze. What now? I asked. He turned away from the cabin and looked out over the plateau, where the snow was receding in patches, revealing the dark earth underneath, the earth that had been 52 degrees all winter, steady and constant and working, doing what earth does when you ask it right. Cistern, he said. Then the garden beds. Then I need to look at the south drainage before Tommy Harmon starts his project. He paused. A lot to do before fall. I laughed. I couldn't help it. 11 weeks of the worst winter in 20 years and he was already in fall. You never stop, I said. I told you, he said. He was almost smiling, that Elias almost smile, a fractional thing, more in the eyes than anywhere else. Just stop adding to it for a while. I want to be precise about the last thing I'll write about that winter. It was a week later. I rode up on a Tuesday, unannounced as always. The day was warm enough that I'd left my heavy coat at the ranch. The spring runoff was moving well. The cabin's south face was in full sun. I knocked, no answer. The door was closed and latched, which meant Elias was somewhere on the property. I waited because that was the habit we'd developed. I sat on the stone bench he'd built against the south wall, sighted perfectly, I noticed again, to catch the afternoon sun, and I waited and I opened my ledger. I had 23 pages of entries about Elias Runningwater and his cabin and that winter. I read back through some of them. The man is serious. He knows something. His grandmother, that's what this is really about. This is what he was building toward, not a structure. A feeling. He's been showing her, in some way I don't have language for, that it worked. I sat in the sun, the same sun the south windows caught, the sun the cabin had been designed, 3,000 years secretly, to receive. And I thought about what you build when you're building for someone who isn't there anymore. Whether it counts. Whether the warmth reaches them, somehow, across whatever distance separates what's here from what's gone. I was still thinking about it when Elias came back from the tree line with a load of deadfall balanced on his shoulder, and he saw me sitting in the sun with my ledger, and he set the wood down and looked at me for a moment. "You're writing," he said. "Always," I said. He picked up the wood again, carried it to the stack. I looked down at the open page, picked up my pencil. The cabin held. The winter was the worst in 20 years and the cabin held. Elias Runningwater built something the cold couldn't get into, using something people learned before anyone living was born, for a woman who died in a house that wasn't warm enough. I paused. I don't know if that's grief resolved or grief redirected. I don't know if there's a difference. I don't know if it matters. I looked up. Elias was splitting the deadfall now, methodical and easy, the axe swinging in that particular rhythm of someone who has found the right angle through long practice. The sun was on the south wall. The spring was running. I wrote one more line. Then I closed the ledger.